Thank you for these very kind and moving introductions. I think my talk had better be good now because the dog is built up. So, quite something. Those of you who know me will hear that I have a cold. And I called James today and asked him whether he would read my talk. And I will just be here for questions, but it seems that my voice is okay, so I'm going to try and see how far I get. I have to sort of change my style of speaking a little. My voice carries usually, but that is a strain on the vocal cords, and so I have to do a sort of very soft storytelling kind of thing. I'm really very happy to be here, and I think this is an ideal place for the event we are organizing, because the very essence of these retreat centers that are inspired by R.D. Laing, the very essence is community. Community is the healing ingredient. And I don't know, this space feels very much like a communal space. When I walked in here tonight, I felt really good right away. And so I'm very happy to be here. So we are talking about the legacy of the Scottish psychiatrist R.D. Laing, arguably the most controversial psychoanalyst since Freud. Laing's impassioned plea for a more humane treatment of those in society who are the most vulnerable established him firmly at the vanguard of an intellectual and cultural debate about the nature of sanity and madness, inspiring a generation of psychology students, intellectuals, and artists. Laing wore many hats during his career: psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, philosopher, social critic, author, jazz pianist, poet, shaman. He was all of those. And at the peak of his fame in the 1970s, he was the most widely read psychiatrist in the world. So in this talk, I would like to share some reminiscences of R.D. Laing and his considerable influence on my life and my work. I met Laing in 1977, and I last saw him in 1988, a year before he died. During these 11 years, we met many times, either just the two of us or with our families and friends. We saw each other at conferences, gave joint seminars, and together participated in panel discussions. In these reminiscences tonight, I want to concentrate on my longest and most intensive encounter with Laing in September of 1980 at a conference about the psychotherapy of the future in Spain, sponsored by the European Association for Humanistic Psychology. The central subject of our discussions at that conference was the nature of experience and the challenge of formulating a future science of experience. At that time, Laing's best-known book was called The Politics, and is called The Politics of Experience, and he was working on another book titled The Voice of Experience. I want to tell you how I experienced Laing's radical and often dramatic methods of inquiry. And I also want to share some of his prescient ideas, which began to be realized by cognitive scientists a decade later. The conference in Spain took place near Zaragoza in a beautiful 12th century monastery, which had been converted into a hotel. The array of participants was very impressive. In addition to Laing, there were Stanislav Grof, Jean Houston, and Rollo May, and the group would have included Gregory Bateson. He had already committed, but unfortunately he died about 2 months before the conference started. During that entire week, I experienced a wonderful feeling of community and adventure created by the extraordinary group of participants and the magnificent setting of the conference. Lectures were held in the old refectory of the monastery, often by candlelight. There were seminars in the cloister and in the garden, and informal discussions on a large balcony until late at night. Laing was the animating spirit of the entire conference. Most of the discussions and happenings revolved around his ideas and the many facets of his personality. He had come to the conference with a large entourage of family, friends, former patients and disciples, including even a small film crew. If you wish, imagine something Fellinesque. That's really what it was. And I should interrupt here. When I really got jealous of Laing was one evening during this week when I asked him a question. I said, "It's written in my book, and my book is right on my night table in my room." I don't know why he didn't want to go up. Anyway, I went to his room, he told me where it was, and so I saw the book on the night table, and next to the book was his diary, his calendar. And the following week there was a note, "Rome, call Fellini." So that's when I really thought he was in a different league. So Laing was active day and night and never seemed to tire. He gave a series of lectures and seminars, spent many evenings in intensive discussions with small groups of people, and he would often end up at the piano long after midnight and reward those who had held out with superb renditions of Cole Porter and Gershwin. During that conference, I really got to know Laing. Up to then, our relationship had been cordial and our discussions very inspiring for me, but it was not until the Saragossa conference that I really got close to him on a personal level. That's also when I began to call him Ronnie, following the example of his friends. So on the day I arrived, Laing invited me after dinner to join him and a group of friends for a glass of cognac and discussions. We all sat down on this balcony, surrounded by the balmy breezes of a beautiful Mediterranean summer evening, Laing and I side by side, leaning against the white stucco wall of the balcony, with a fairly large circle of people in front of us. Laing asked me what I had been up to in the past 2 years. I told him that I was working on a new book, The Turning Point, and that lately I had become interested in the nature of mind and consciousness. The next thing I knew, Laing was attacking me extremely vigorously. "How dare you, as a scientist, even ask about the nature of consciousness?" He scowled indignantly. "You have absolutely no right to ask that question, to even use words like consciousness or mystical experience. It is preposterous of you to dare mention science and Buddhism in the same breath." This was not a joking, teasing confrontation. It was the beginning of a serious, vigorous, and sustained attack on my position as a scientist, voiced passionately in an angry and accusing tone. I was shocked. I was not prepared at all for such an outburst. Laing was supposed to be on my side. Indeed, he had been. And I was especially taken aback by his attacking me like this on the day I had arrived and in front of a large group. At the same time, I felt his intellectual challenge, and my shock and confusion soon gave way to intense mental activity as I tried to understand Laing's position, evaluate it, and prepare myself for responding. In fact, as he continued his passionate diatribe against science, which he saw me as representing, I found myself becoming very excited. I've always enjoyed intellectual challenge, and this was the most dramatic challenge I had ever encountered. Laing had placed our dialogue in a spectacular setting. He was a master of organizing settings for discussions. So not only was I leaning against the wall of the balcony, facing Laing's tribe of friends and disciples, I also felt pushed against the wall metaphorically by his relentless attack. But I did not mind. In my state of excitement, all traces of embarrassment and discomfort had disappeared. The main point of Laing's attack was that science had no way of dealing with consciousness or with experience, values, ethics, or anything referring to quality. This situation derives from something that happened in European consciousness at the time of Galileo and Giordano Bruno. Laing began his argument. These two men epitomize two paradigms. Bruno, who was tortured and burned for saying that there were infinite worlds, and Galileo, who said that the scientific method was to study this world as if there were no consciousness and no living creatures in it. Galileo made the statement that only quantifiable phenomena were admitted to the domain of science. Galileo said, whatever cannot be measured and quantified is not scientific. And in post-Galilean science, this came to mean what cannot be quantified is not real. This has been the most profound corruption, Laing continued, from the Greek view of nature as physis, which is alive, always in transformation and not divorced from us. Galileo's program offered us a dead world. Out go sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. And along with them have since gone aesthetic and ethical sensibility, values, quality, soul, consciousness, spirit. Experience as such is cast out of the realm of scientific discourse. Hardly anything has changed our world more during the past 400 years than Galileo's audacious program. We had to destroy the world in theory before we could destroy it in practice. So you have to imagine this was a flow of words, you know, without notes or preparation or anything. It just went on, and I wish I could imitate his Scottish accent. It was even more powerful, you know, in this Scottish road. But you know, listen to this, to his, you know, culminating punchline. We had to destroy the world in theory before we could destroy it in practice. It makes you shiver. Laing's critique was devastating. But as he paused and reached for his cognac, and before I could say anything in reply, he leaned over to me and whispered under his breath so that nobody could hear it, "You don't mind me setting you up like that, do you?" So, and this was really masterful. Nobody heard it. It was really very close. He leaned over to me and whispered it in my ear. And with that aside, he instantly created a conspiratorial mood and shifted the whole context of his attack. It was just a dramatic shift. It was just a dramatic shift with this little aside. So I whispered back, "No, I don't mind," and then I had to concentrate on my response. I defended myself as well as I could, being put on the spot with hardly any time for reflection. I said that I agreed with Laing's analysis of Galileo's role in the history of science, and at the same time, I made a mental note to emphasize this more in my book, which I hadn't, but I did agree with him. I also agreed with him that there was no room for experience, values, and ethics in the science of today. However, I then went on to say that my own endeavor was precisely to help change today's science in such a way that these considerations could be incorporated into the scientific framework of the future. To do so, I emphasized, the first step had to be the shift from the mechanistic and fragmented approach of classical science to a holistic paradigm, in which the main emphasis was no longer on separate entities, but on relationships. This would make it possible to introduce context and meaning. Only when one had that holistic framework, I concluded, could one begin to take further steps in response to Laing's concerns. Well, Laing was not immediately satisfied with my response. He was sort of crouching, hanging in there, scowling still. He wanted a more radical approach, going beyond the intellect altogether. The universe was a vast machine yesterday, he said sarcastically. It is a hologram today. Who knows what intellectual rattle will be shaking tomorrow? And so the argument went back and forth for quite a while, and in the midst of it, Laing leaned over to me once more and said softly in a confidential tone, "You realize the questions I'm asking you are all questions I'm asking myself. I'm not just attacking you or other scientists out there. I'm tarred with the same brush. I could not get so curled up over this if it were not a personal struggle." So again, he created this bond of confidentiality, of camaraderie and conspiracy. So the discussion went on until very late that night, and when I finally went to bed, I still could not sleep for a long time. Laing had presented me with a tremendous challenge. I spent most of the next day pondering the problem, and in the evening I was ready to see him again. "I've thought a lot about what you said last night, Ronnie," I told him at dinner, "and I would like to respond to your critique in a more complete and systematic way tonight, if you feel like sitting down with me for another glass of cognac." Laing agreed, and so we settled down on the balcony again after dinner in the same setting as the night before. "I would like to present to you tonight," I began, "as completely and systematically as I can, the view of mind and consciousness that I see emerging from the conceptual framework that I'm now developing. This is not a framework in which your critique can be fully satisfied, but I believe, as I said last night, that it is a necessary first step toward that goal. From the vantage point of my new framework, you can actually begin to see how experience, values, and consciousness might be incorporated into science in the future." Laing simply nodded his head and kept listening attentively with intense concentration. I then proceeded to give him a concise summary of my ideas. I began with the view of living organisms as self-organizing systems, explained Prigoghine's notion of dissipative structures, and emphasized especially the view of biological forms as being shaped by underlying processes. I then wove in Bateson's concept of mind as the dynamics of self-organization. At that time, I was not yet familiar with Maturana's more detailed concept of cognition as the process of life. Then I specified what I meant by consciousness. What I meant was the property of mind characterized by self-awareness. Awareness, I argued, is a property of mind at all levels of complexity. Self-awareness, as far as we know, manifests itself only in higher animals and fully unfolds in the human mind. And it is this property of mind that I mean by consciousness. Now, if we look at theories of consciousness, I continued, we can see that most of them are variations of two seemingly opposite views. One of these views I will call the Western scientific view. It considers matter as primary and consciousness as a property of complex material patterns, which emerges at a certain level of biological evolution. Most neuroscientists today subscribe to this view. So this was in 1980, but the situation still has not changed very much. This is still valid today. I paused for a moment, and seeing that Laing had no intention of interjecting anything, I proceeded. The other view of consciousness may be called the mystical view, since it is generally held in mystical traditions. It regards consciousness as the primary reality, as the essence of the universe, the ground of all being, and everything else, all forms of matter and all living beings, as manifestations of that pure consciousness. This mystical view of consciousness is based on the experience of reality in non-ordinary modes of awareness. And such mystical experience, they say, is indescribable. It is any experience, Laing shouted, interrupting me forcefully. And when he saw my puzzled look, he repeated, any experience of reality is indescribable. Just look around you for a moment and see, hear, smell, and feel where you are. I did as he told me, becoming fully aware of the mild summer night, the white walls of the balcony against the outline of trees in the park, the sound of crickets, the half moon hanging in the sky, and the closeness, attention of the crowd surrounding us, experiencing a symphony of shades, sounds, smells, and feelings, while Laing continued. Your consciousness can partake all that in one single moment, but you will never be able to describe the experience. It's not just mystical experience, it's any experience. I knew that Laing was right. Okay, Ronnie, any experience, I agreed. Now, since the mystical view of consciousness is based on direct experience, we should not expect science at its present stage to confirm or contradict it. Nevertheless, I feel that the system's view of mind seems to be perfectly consistent with both views and could therefore provide an ideal framework for unifying the two. Again, I paused briefly to collect my thoughts, and as Laing remained silent, I went on to clinch my argument. The system's view agrees with the conventional scientific view that consciousness is a property of complex material patterns. To be precise, it is a property of living systems of a certain complexity. On the other hand, the biological structures of these living systems are manifestations of underlying processes. What processes? Well, the processes of self-organization, which we have identified as mental processes. In this sense, biological structures are manifestations of mind. Now, if we extend this way of thinking to the universe as a whole, it is not too far-fetched to assume that all its structures, from subatomic particles to galaxies and from bacteria to human beings, are manifestations of the universal dynamics of self-organization. In other words, of the cosmic mind. And this, more or less, is the mystical view. I realize, I concluded, that there are several gaps in this argument. Still, I feel that the system's view of life provides a meaningful framework for unifying the two opposing views of the age-old questions of the nature of life, mind, and consciousness. Now I fell silent. My long monologue had been a tremendous effort for me. For the first time, I had laid out as clearly and concisely as I could my entire framework for approaching the questions of life, mind, and consciousness. I had presented it to the most knowledgeable and forceful critic, and had been as inspired, spontaneous, and alert as I would ever be. So this was my answer to Laing's challenge of the previous evening. And after a while I asked him, how does that sound to you, Ronnie? What do you think of it? Laing lit a cigarette, took a sip of cognac, and those of you who knew him will know that he was into these rituals. It took a long time for him to light a cigarette and to get another sip of cognac and to get ready. And finally, he made the most encouraging comment that I could have hoped for. "I will have to think about it," he said simply. "This is not something I can address myself to right away. You have introduced quite a few new ideas, and I will have to think about them." With this comment, the tension that had persisted for the last hour was broken, and we spent the rest of the evening in a very relaxed and warm conversation in which Ronnie and I were joined by many of our group. During the next 2 days, I spent most of my time with Laing and his friends in a relaxed and playful mood without ever mentioning our discussion. After a couple of days of relaxation and some more thinking, I invited Laing to join me for coffee after lunch. A true science of consciousness, I proposed, would have to be a new type of science, dealing with qualities rather than quantities, and being based on shared experience rather than verifiable measurements. The data of such a science would be patterns of experience that cannot be quantified or analyzed. On the other hand, the conceptual models interconnecting the data would have to be logically consistent, like all scientific models, and might even include quantitative elements. Such a new science would quantify its statements whenever this method is appropriate, but would also be able to deal with qualities and values based on human experience. I would add to this, Laing replied, that the new science, the new epistemology, has got to be predicated upon a change of heart, upon a complete turning around from the intent to dominate and control nature to the idea, for example, of Francis of Assisi, that the whole creation is our companion, if not our mother. That is part of your turning point. Only then can we address ourselves to alternative perceptions that will come into view. As I reflected on Laing's comment, several of our friends entered the cafe, and Laing asked me whether I minded if they joined us. Of course I did not mind, and Ronnie invited them to sit down. "Let me just tell these people what you and I have been talking about," he continued. "If you don't mind, let me just reiterate what you have been saying." He then proceeded to give a brilliant summary of what I had said 3 nights before and during the last hour. He summarized the entire conceptual framework in his own words, in his highly idiosyncratic style, with all the intensity and passion that were characteristic of him. After this brilliant discourse, there was no more doubt in my mind that Laing had accepted my ideas. And of course, I was extremely happy. Now, the question of how experience might be approached within a new scientific framework, which had been the main subject of my discussions with Ronnie Laing, came into full focus in cognitive science a decade later. During the 1970s and 80s, the study of consciousness as lived experience was still taboo among most scientists. But during the 1990s, the situation changed dramatically. While cognitive science established itself as a broad interdisciplinary field of study, new non-invasive techniques for analyzing brain functions were developed, which made it possible to observe complex neural processes associated with mental imagery and other human experiences. And suddenly, the scientific study of consciousness became a respectable and lively field of research. The central challenge of this research was and still is to explain the experience associated with cognitive events. Different states of conscious experience are sometimes called qualia by cognitive scientists because each state is characterized by a special qualitative field, as Laing emphasized in our discussions. The challenge of explaining these qualia is often called the hard problem of consciousness study, an expression coined by the philosopher David Chalmers. In the mid-90s, biologist and neuroscientist Francisco Varela proposed a new approach to this hard problem that embraces both brain physiology and the analysis of first-person experience. Varela called his new school of thought neurophenomenology. Phenomenology, as you may know, is an important branch of modern philosophy, founded by the Austrian philosopher Edmund Husserl at the beginning of the 20th century, and developed further by many European philosophers, including Martin Heidegger and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. The central concern of phenomenology is the disciplined examination of experience. And the hope of Husserl and his followers was and is that a true science of experience would eventually be established in partnership with the natural sciences. So neurophenomenology is an approach to the study of consciousness that combines phenomenology, that is the disciplined examination of conscious experience, with the analysis of corresponding neural patterns and processes. With this dual approach, neurophenomenologists explore various domains of experience and try to understand how they emerge from complex neural activities. In doing so, these cognitive scientists are indeed taking the first steps toward formulating a true science of experience. Prominent neurophenomenologists today include Walter Freeman and Antonio Damasio. I don't know to what extent these scientists were influenced by Laing's views on the centrality of experience in human consciousness, which he published in 1982 in his book, The Voice of Experience. All I know is that my own attempts over the past 30 years to map out a science of qualities, integrating the biological, cognitive, social, and ecological dimensions of life, were triggered by my dramatic discussions with Ronnie Laing under the starry sky of Zaragoza. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I enjoyed hearing that much more than I enjoyed reading it, though I enjoyed reading it a great deal. So I think we have a microphone maybe set up for questions and answers.
Can we have more light in the audience if we can see each other? Is that possible?
I think that will soon happen. But maybe in the meantime, I had just a couple questions. Shevik's going to set up this microphone. If you have questions, please line up here. I just have a couple questions while you do that. Firtjof, I was curious. You've been involved in the realm of physics, and you've been involved in the realm of, I think, philosophy surrounding science. A great deal, and of course you knew R.D. Laing, but I'm curious. You've been involved in Gnosis Retreat Center for how long now?
No. I'm involved in your project, but I have not been to any of the traditional centers that people like Michael and others were in London.
Right.
I met Laing at the end of the 70s, and I was doing my own thing. I was not into psychiatry.
But not like Kingsley Hall or anything like that.
No.
But now you're involved in Gnosis Retreat Center.
Well,
what brought you to do that?
Well, I'm this whole group of you guys and many who are not here tonight, and these people, about 40 people who meet regularly at SLM. These are highly intellectual discussions that I wouldn't be part of otherwise. Because I don't move in these circles. I move in other circles of, systems theory, ecology, physics, complexity theory. But the nature of sanity and madness is not something I discuss with other people. So I'm fascinated by that. And there's also an emotional component. I think you guys who are preparing to live with people in these extreme states, and I've seen enough videos to know what this is like, you're just heroes. And I want to honor that and contribute in whatever way I can. So I feel this is a very, very special thing.
Well, I do have one more question, but please, if you have questions, feel free to line up here. I'm very grateful for Firtjof's involvement in the Gnosis Retreat Center project. I think it brings a whole new kind of edge and a whole new kind of perspective other than what's there from the purely psychological perspective. You know, it brings this discussion of fringe experiences and altered experiences of reality into a perspective that allows us to examine the larger experience of reality through physics, and that's the primary way we do.
You know, I should maybe add that I had some experiences in the 60s that were similar, because in the 60s we experimented with LSD and peyote and all that, and we went through quite extreme altered states. And I remember one occasion which will sound very familiar to you, which could happen in the Gnosis Retreat Center. My wife and I were living in Santa Cruz, and one evening, I don't know, we picked up this hippie girl, so she came to our door, I don't remember. She had overdosed on LSD. It was a really serious psychotic case. And so we tried to help her, and there was a hotline. And so we called the hotline for LSD overdose and let her speak to this woman who ran the hotline. And it was a Christian hotline. And so the woman said, well, I can advise you, pray to Jesus and it will help you. And you know what the girl said? What do you mean, pray to Jesus? I just saw him. So this is to tell you that I had experiences like this, and actually I never thought about that, but you know, a whole 2 or 3 years in the late 70s and late 60s and early 70s, I went through a lot of these experiences with my friends, and so a fascination of altered states arose at that time, and so I have this connection also.
You know, I really relate to that. That's really what drew me to Gnosis Retreat Center is also this. I mean, if you look at psychedelic experiences, my own psychedelic experience, or if you've ever been with someone on a psychedelic experience, you can, and been with someone who is been labeled psychotic or something like that, you can definitely see that there's just too many common themes, you know, between these things, and it's very meaningful.
Should we hear from that?
Yes, please.
Thank you guys, this is a very fascinating discussion. I think I wanted to try to put it all together in a more practical understanding, because I have a lot of bits and pieces floating around. And maybe you can correct me where I'm wrong, because I think your theory is complex and hard to take in. But from what I understand, you're saying that we are communal creatures that require community, and this is even shown at a molecular level, and it's sort of an undeniable thing that we are part of the system where we need each other. Is that what you're saying?
Let me first say that what I presented to you was historical, right? My arguments this was the conversation I had with Laing in 1980. And so all these theories, including my own understanding, have advanced quite a bit since then. Mm-hmm. And so in my book, The Systems View of Life, I present a whole synthesis of my current understanding. But I would disagree just with one point. the need for community seems to arise when life emerges, not at the molecular level, but when life emerges with the first cell that evolved was actually a colony of bacteria. These first living beings formed communities, and life has continued to form communities ever since. In fact, I often say that the way to create a sustainable future is to create and nurture communities. That's what nature does. We know that no individual organism can live by itself. You know, plants and animals, animals, including humans, need the energy the plants provide with photosynthesis. The plants need the oxygen, need the nitrogen fixation of their roots by bacteria and other microorganisms. So there's always this interdependence. And this is why in the long story of evolution, those strategies for survival that worked were the strategies that involved communities.
Okay, that's helpful. And the second part of my question, for those of you who don't know, we also have regular salons every few months where we talk about different things in relation to Gnosis Retreat Center. And the last salon that we had, we talked about the idea of self and Sartre and free will. And Michael mentioned Sartre's idea that the self is an experience emerging in situations. And I guess I'm thinking about what's going to happen once this project is launched and we're in community and we're living in this house together, how you understand that at a more systems level, like what you perceive to happen in terms of healing, how that goes down.
Well, here I'm really at the edge of my thinking, you know, and I can't give you an explanation or anything like that. But it seems, as I said before, that community is the main healing ingredient. And why this is so, this would actually be a great thing to explore. Once we have salons, once we have the house and meet, to explore what actually is the healing, what's the role of community, and why is community therapeutic?
Yeah, hopefully
Maybe
an ongoing
Michael,
discussion.
you know that already, maybe. And you guys have so much experience with that.
Well, I just quickly say,
Yeah.
in these other sanctuaries that I've been involved in, and even in individual meetings with people in extreme states, there's an experience there, some kind of essence. Again, it's kind of intangible, but I think it has to do with that Laing said was a prerequisite for this discussion, had to do with the change of heart.
Yeah.
That when we're with someone and we're feeling ourselves open and compassionate and empathic, a lot of the research I think is showing that itself is kind of a necessary and sufficient condition. So if you set up a house where that's intentionally happening and people are striving towards goodwill towards each other, I think that's enhances that possibility of agape, of love.
Yeah. So there's emotional security that is, would you say that is provided?
Yeah, and nurturance, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Thank you. Forgive me if I missed something because I wasn't here right at the beginning. My question is about the systems view of consciousness, which, if I understood correctly, is a rather charming sandwich between the Western view and the mystical view, where you have the principle of self-organization, which has mental properties or mind,